Now, we were talking about dogs before we left, but we were actually talking about engaging with aspects of ourselves where we can let ourselves go enough so that we feel soft inside as if we cared for someone very deeply who happens to be in front of us that we don't like that much. The Buddhists and the Hindus, I think, if I'm not sure about the Buddhists, but I believe the Hindus often talked about when you had a love with your mother, for example, that you cared so much for your mother, you would think in your mind that you were attempting to talk to your mother, and you would talk that way. For those who didn't have a very good relationship with their mother, of course, this wouldn't work very well. But nonetheless, what they were trying to do is reach into the scale within themselves of loving of the self, loving coarser. In other words, loving the way you're acting because it's the only way that you trust that you can uh, live because you were very not able to trust very much. This is not abnormal. But we have little boxes of personality trusts that we slip people into as we engage with them. And we do it unconsciously. We have no idea we're doing these things, of course, but they occur almost automatically. And this is not to devalue us, but it's to help us to understand that we do this simply because we're concerned about doing it any other way, because we would be exposing our vulnerability too much to someone that isn't trustworthy. At least that's how we think. And this happens, of course, in a very reflexive manner. And because there's not very much thought that's in this, until we attempt to allow ourselves to open just a little bit more. And then we truly begin to notice that we are looking at it from a different perspective. And and we feel a little bit vulnerable. Therefore, we once again are protecting almost automatically ourselves from caring too much. Or we have statements: if you care too much, this will happen. Uh, or you can care this way, but not that way. Or if you care this way, this means you must be open to being like this or like that. These are all levels of compromises that we make with the idea of allowing ourselves to be compassionate, to be loving. Um, and you can even have a control mechanism that relates to loving. You can say, oh, I love them, I love this, I love that, but there's no interaction with it. And that is not that it's negative, it's a self protecting system that allows us literally to be okay with ourselves and fundamentally allow a little bit of expression to occur um, that reassures us on the surface that we can be loving to at least to some degree. And that little small degree may, in our minds, think we may think that it's quite a lot. The real deep interaction with loving is and can be spontaneous, but the dilemma with that is how do you make sense of it? Marlene and I were in Mexico one time, still with birds and animals, and there was a bird singing in a tree. We were about, I think, the second or third level up in some hotel, and I noticed that the heart center internally came on, and I walked to the window to see if that heart center would affect mine more and mine might affect it more. In fact, the bird stayed there a long time, singing its heart out. It seemed to improve in its singing, but I'm not a real connoisseur of bird sing. So, but it may have been that that bird was affected by my capacity a little bit, and I was definitely affected by it. I could perceive that to be real. You see, from person to person, the effect of loving that we have is real inside. We may not look like we're loving. We may not even sound like we're loving, but we are in some manner. You cannot take away the word love out of that context. If you do, then you will bring in the words judgment, criticism, devaluation, vulnerability, even more than they are in reality. Because in reality, a person may be loving themselves because they're dreadfully afraid that if they don't in the way that they're normally used to in a certain context, they will be hurt. There isn't a person alive that can't relate to that particular statement unless they're not conscious of ever being hurt or ever protecting themselves ever so much because they are deathly afraid of being hurt all the time. These are fundamental. In many traditions, people have talked about the only thing you have to be afraid of is fear itself. And the construct of that doesn't have very much to do with fear, but it brings up the relationship that a person has with the self protection that is necessary from the view of an individual who has to self protect to feel comforted. By that self protecting nature that is cultivated, you protect against loving in a different way than self protection or fear allows you to protect yourself. Fear allows you to protect yourself in a strange way because then you do something, whatever it is, and that is a rendering of helping you to feel less vulnerable. Even if you feel more vulnerable, your focus is on the vulnerability being important in that context, and that becomes something that you focus on rather than focusing on the fear of not loving. There are traditions that say, take in these things into you and be okay with them. It's a very hard thing to do. But they do that with the idea that search for love inside yourself and you'll find it protecting yourself against things that you think you need protection against. It is not negative at all. It's a constructed system that humanity takes into them to try and help themselves survive certain circumstances. And there are some terrible circumstances, but there are some very wondrous circumstances. Now, I did talk about another level of loving, a deeper one. And often that level of loving comes upon you. But if others are using those levels of loving, it can influence you, for example, to protect against those kinds of loving. Because it is very much dependent on the definitions that you harbor internally around your own engagement with life. Do I deserve this loving? Why should they love me under these circumstances? Because you're a loving being, even though you don't understand that you are loving you in the only way you know how. And you are loving you against being hurt more. You are loving you because if you don't do it the way you believe you need to, somehow you will be terribly vulnerable. Energy comes in very strongly with the root and gonad centers and the emotional dispositional centers. And they move, those subtle energies move up into your brow, for example, your throat. And it's as if constantly that deeper soul energy is trying to, or deeper uh, unaffected energy before it's presented to you, or love presented to you, to do with as you believe you need to do with that energy to help you to survive. Seems a little radical that we can't really perceive that flow coming in as soft and gentle and kind, but it's not. We're reflexively, from the time of our birth and even before, engaging with and trying to get mm, senses of what we should do and how we should do it and why we should do it this way, reflexively, consciously, so that we can attempt to help ourselves to literally understand life, of course, typically the way we've always understood it, but broadening that out in a movement beyond our understanding so we can continue to grow as an individual, as a person, as a being of consciousness, whatever you want to use in terms of your verbalizations. But remember, you have a reflex to protect yourself in terms of what you believe must be true because you think it. That is a natural state in our human society. And you can prove this to yourself every day if you watch it in others and start to see it in yourselves. This is not a negative thing. This is just what we do. This is the act of living. We have sometimes great difficulty understanding how to broaden that out. And the ancients recommended slow and easy, keeping your attention to what you're doing, knowing also there's something going on the inside that is slightly different than how you're acting on the outside. The unconscious reflex of it is much faster than that. Your conscious engagement is slower. That's why becoming more consciously aware allows you time, pause within you to practice noticing what's going on the inside, not because it's bad or good, but because that's training there. That's where we're kind of constructed in that cloud of energy around you that you use, that is always there for every reflex reaction and every conscious reaction that we might be a part of in our life. So negation is not something that is helpful, but it's something that we practiced. I hope this helps a little bit because what I just said there was loving occurs on all levels. And it's like a continuum. It starts off relative to the individual learning how to live in our life right here and liking how it does it or not liking how it does it. Then the input from others, and we start to agree with their input, whatever it is, doesn't matter what it is. Or we make up stories about how true it must be or how false it might be. And there are no parents that are perfect, no human beings that are perfect. Perfect means something like this: a flow of energy moving into you in love, where you forget who you are. It's basically not relevant. But you're in that flow and you can be conscious of that flow. And wherever you go, that flow affects others. The same as you being uncomfortable with that flow. Wherever you go, that affects others. But listen, you live in a world called Earth. You're a part of humanity. Humanity is that way. It doesn't know it very well, consciously, but wherever it goes, energy transmits from an individual to others. That energy, some of these exercises, is one of the reasons why we practice some of these things. We can redirect that intense self protection upward into a view or a construction of a view that sees it not as negative, but more how we have learned how to survive. And we can slowly adjust that. Emotionally, intensity, we can bring that flow upwards towards the heart center, through then and bring it up into the mind plane where you can build a little form, an internal lens where you can watch you and be okay with you, knowing you're okay because this is a method of survival that is currently available unconsciously to you because you practiced it and you are slowly adding more to it that broadens it out so it doesn't have to only be that way. There's no negation in these things. And with your internal will through the gonad center, bringing it up towards the throat center, and often it comes up into that direction emotionally, and then we don't redirect it again into that brow center so that it can be, yes, emotional, if that's what your practice is in life, but also tending to an allowance to see beyond the defensive aspects that are created by that mental, emotional structure to protect itself. And there's no negation in that whatsoever. But there is a kind of attending, a kind of conscious attending. This, if you spend 60 years or 50 years or 40 years practicing one way, it doesn't take a week of one time or 1 week or 1 month or 1 year of not doing it that way to eliminate anything. You are still there the way you were. You just don't use it as much as you used to. And that means you becoming an individual, a conscious individual, for the purpose of being okay with deepening a, a love past your own self interest into states that are there and available, but more subtle than we're used to being aware of. Subtlety is an interesting companion. With that subtlety, we also have rules and regulations about how that should be in our domain, our world. To be spiritual, one must be, you fill in the blank. In that, you will have a rule. If you have a constructed belief, which is natural for all of us, then you will have a rule that relates to that constructed belief, whatever belief you have. If you can use it to be helpful to others, you're not making others believe the way you do. You're trying to be helpful to others in the way that they can learn how to grow through them, not through you. You can be helpful by allowing your tenderness, your gentleness, your respectfulness, your loving compassion to spread beyond you, not by faking it, just being it. So to do that, you have to do that in yourself, and you will find all kinds of impediments. Impediments are normal. Treat them as such, but you don't have to agree with them. So others have impediments too. Treat them like, oh my gosh, that one is one I don't have. I have it in a different place. Then you don't negate that person as much. Your reflexes will, you're trained to do so. But you don't have to comply necessarily with those reflexes all the time. Catch yourself when you do, catch yourself when you don't. Be as comforting to the ones you do or don't, and continue, continue, continue. I wish you well. We're well over time, but I'm sorry it blanked out a little bit. And I hope everyone is fine. We're going to try and do a little meditation in spite of the time. It's about 8:15. And Marlene's going to set that up for us. And thanks to Joelle and Marlene for helping to get this thing working again. And I wish you all well. Stay safe and help each other. Remind each other. Take care. Good luck. And we'll just begin to come out of this meditation on your own, or you can continue on your own as well. Good night.